The Great London Beer Flood, a historical catastrophe. London Beer Flood. October 17, 1814, a normal day in London's St. Giles district, until it wasn't. In an instant, a massive tidal wave of beer, yes, beer, came crashing through the streets, leaving destruction and tragedy in its wake. How did this happen? And how did beer, of all things, turn deadly? Let's dive into the unbelievable true story of the Great London Beer Flood. The Great London Beer Flood, a historical catastrophe. Early 19th century London was a city of industry, innovation, and beer. Lots of beer. The Mew & Co. brewery located on Tottenham Court Road was one of the largest in the city, famous for producing porter, a dark, rich ale loved by Londoners. The Great London Beer Flood, a historical catastrophe. But brewing beer back then was no small task. The brewery stored its beer in massive wooden vats, some over 20 feet tall, held together by iron hoops. One particular vat contained more than 135,000 gallons of beer. That's nearly 500,000 liters. The Great London Beer Flood, a historical catastrophe. But what happens when you push wooden structures to their limits? Disaster! The Great London Beer Flood, a historical catastrophe. On that fateful afternoon, one of the metal hoops holding a vat together suddenly snapped. The immense pressure was too much, and within seconds, The Great London Beer Flood, a historical catastrophe. Boom! The vat burst apart, unleashing a flood of beer with unimaginable force. The pressure from the explosion knocked over other vats, causing a chain reaction. In total, over 320,000 gallons of beer, the equivalent of 500,000 pints, rushed out in a tidal wave. The Great London Beer Flood, a historical catastrophe. The flood smashed through the brewery walls, sending a torrent of ale crashing into the crowded, poverty-stricken streets of St. Giles. The Great London Beer Flood, a historical catastrophe. It was a 10-foot-high tsunami of beer sweeping away everything in its path. The Great London Beer Flood, a historical catastrophe. The hardest hit? A nearby tenement house where entire families lived in cramped, damp basements. The force of the flood demolished walls and trapped people underneath. The Great London Beer Flood, a historical catastrophe. In the end, 8 people lost their lives, either drowned or crushed by debris. Rescue efforts were slow, and for some, the damage was irreversible. Unimaginable catastrophe is about to happen. You'd think someone would be held responsible, right? Well, not exactly. The courts ruled it an act of God, and New & Co. faced no legal consequences. In fact, they were even given a tax break to help recover their losses. Then the disaster happened. Today, the Moo Brewery is long gone, but the story of the London beer flood remains a bizarre, tragic, and strangely darkly humorous piece of history. A flood of beer might sound like a dream, but in 1814, for the people of St. Giles, it was a nightmare. So the next time you raise a glass, spare a thought for the victims of the Great London Beer Flood, a moment in history when too much beer really was a bad thing. Cheers.